which don't exist anymore. Mad Magazine's going out of business.
Yes, it's going to California.
It's going out of, you know, hey, Alfred E. Newman, worry.
Yes.
You can worry now.
Yeah.
Anyway, he wrote for magazines such as Collier's. Remember Collier's? Long guy. And he was the spokesman for 3 Walt Disney television specials on space travel, Man in Space. So you got the machine going. Werner von Braun is on. He's a nice guy. He's gonna. You could be an astronaut too. Sputnik. How many of you remember Sputnik back in 1957? Let me ask you a question. Were you afraid of Sputnik?
No, I'm not sure.
Not sure. There are people that were really afraid of Sputnik. Why? There's a satellite up there. Soviets have won the space race. And by extension, they control space militarily. Sputnik was launched on October 4th, 1957. Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, which is Russian for traveler. It was the world's first artificial satellite, first man-made object to be placed in Earth's orbit. Sputnik was no more than a beach ball. That's all it was. It was a beach ball. Weighed about 180 pounds. It was filled with communications equipment. Had 4 legs on there. I don't know why it had 4 legs. Maybe it was going to walk somewhere eventually. It careened through space for 3 months. Circled the Earth about every 100 minutes. And you had a regular pattern of beeps. Beep, beep, beep. Beep, beep, beep ended up in rock and roll music, including Purple People Eaters.
Oh, yeah.
Beep, 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 beep. Hey, you know, those guys would do anything to sell a record in those days. So anyway, you got Purple People Eaters by Sheb Wooley. Purple People Eaters. The launch of Sputnik kicked off the Cold War in space. Soviets would have a very early lead. Obviously, the United States would recover and land on the moon eventually. First American satellite successfully launched 1958 in Cape Canaveral. It's a hockey player by the name of Bill Cleary, who was on the national hockey team, American national hockey team, 1956 and 1960. Now, why would you ask, am I introducing hockey in a space talk? Any idea? Well, Bill Cleary was part of the 1956 American Olympic team. And the American Olympic team was either invited or told that they could go to the Soviet Union for an exhibition tour. Dwight Eisenhower was the president, and he sees that their tension is increasing and increasing and increasing between the Soviets and the Americans, and he's looking, trying to find something that may bring down the temperature. Nixon did through ping pong in 1971. Opened up China. Where do you think he got that idea from? Maybe. Anyway, Eisenhower decides, we'll send a hockey team, we'll send a track and field team, and in return, the Soviets sent the Bolshoi Ballet, and I used to love Ed Sullivan watching this, the Dancing Bears from the Moscow Circus. Remember the Dancing Bears? What does this have to do with space? Well, it has a lot to do with space. Cleary is with his teammates, there are about 25 people in the traveling party, go to Moscow in 1958. They're going to do these exhibitions, and they land in Moscow, get to the hotel, and then they go into the ballroom where they're going to have a festive meal. And they sit down, and on top of every menu is a miniature Sputnik. Why? We beat you. We're trying to intimidate you. And Cleary said it was pretty funny. And then they went to their rooms, Cleary told me, and then checked for electronic bugs in the blinds. But anyway, the United States was having trouble launching satellites, and Soviets were intimidating hockey players with little models of Sputnik. You know, I got to watch the Bears, the Dancing Bears on Ed Sullivan, and so did you. So did you. That's Laika the dog. Laika the dog. Laika the dog was the first animal to go into space. She was going to give her life up for space exploration and scientific research, and did. 36 dogs. And there's a different story that came out with Laika. The initial story was she went up in Sputnik 2, had a good time, but eventually she was going to die because it was just going to go round and round and round the Earth, and she would die painlessly, and eventually the satellite would burn up. But in 2002, the Moscow Institute for Biological Problems came up with the real story about Laika. She died within hours of takeoff because of panic and overheating. Sputnik 2 continued to orbit the Earth for 5 months. She was dead up there for almost 5 months, then burnt up when it re-entered the atmosphere in 1958. That's one of the United States failures, the Vanguard failure. The first program after Sputnik was Vanguard. It was a joint National Academy of Science, U.S. Naval Research Laboratory project, resulted in spectacular and embarrassing failures. The Vanguard TV3, and you can see the video, which is by the time that the Vanguard went up, Sputnik 1 and 2 had gone up, and they carried the dog Laika into space. There's the Explorer 1, January 31st, 1958, finally gets up into space. NASA. Dwight Eisenhower has NASA created in 1958. The U.S. launched the Explorer 1, which was designed by the Army under the direction of von Braun. The same year, Dwight Eisenhower decides, let's put together an agency just dedicated to space exploration. Gagarin was the first man in space. Did you ever wonder why the United States didn't have any women astronauts until the 1980s? Did you ever wonder why?
Discrimination.
Well, that's part of it, but there's more to it according to Dick Hull. Dick said they couldn't design a spacesuit for women. Different plumbing. They could not figure out the proper spacesuit for a woman, even though the Soviets did have a woman going up in space in 1962. The Soviets in 1959 took another step forward. Lunar 2 goes to the moon. Gagarin, April 61 rather, would become the first person to travel around the Earth. Those are the Mercury 7 astronauts: Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, Deke Slayton, Donald Slayton, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, and Gordon Cooper. Now, the question is, you're looking to hire astronauts, what do you look for? What do you look for in an astronaut? What do you look for? This is a new profession, totally. Totally. You know it's risky, you know it's dangerous. Now, what do you look for? Anybody have any clue?
Endurance.
Experience.
Science background. Thrill
You have
seekers.
this, that's it, thrill seekers.
Thrill seekers.
Thrill seekers. They had no idea. They had zero idea. They had all these people applying, and eventually they whittled it down to these 7 guys. Carpenter, Cooper, Glenn, Grissom, Schirra, Shepard, and Slate. And they became stars for doing nothing. They were on the cover of Life magazine, as were their wives. They hadn't done anything yet, except they were picked as the 7 astronauts. And Life magazine, first person reports by astronauts, start of continuing exclusive stories on the Epical mission. There are the 7. That is September 14th, 1959. No one knew what the criteria was. What are we doing? We're sending guys in space. That's never happened before. When choosing who would make the best astronauts, they thought of high-risk professionals, daredevils. Then finally they said, you know what, why don't we just go into the military and see what pilots want to do this, and that's what they did. So they picked these 7 guys. They also picked Ham the Chip. Oh, Ham the Chip. Oh. Ham the Chip was, you must have watched the Today Show when J. Fred Muggs was on the show. Yes, yes, well, he's not related, Ham. Ham the Chip was picked in 1959 to go into space. July of 1959, he was 2 years old, and he was trained to do simple tasks in response to electric lights and sounds. During his pre-flight training, Ham was taught to push a lever within 5 seconds of seeing a flashing blue light. However, if he failed to do that, he would get a mild electric shock in his feet. But if he did do that, he worked rather cheap. He worked for bananas. So, hey, the correct response, here's a banana. Work cheap. Work cheap. He did go into space. He wasn't a passenger. He was the actual chimp that led up to the next flight, which would be Alan Shepard on May 5th, 1961. Look how happy Ham is. Dewey defeats Truman. Oh no, that's not that headline. I did pieces for the San Francisco Examiner, actually, so we have something in common. Me and Ham the Chimp have something in common. Space Chimp lives, paves way, flight by man. Look at him. Look how happy he looks. He looks as happy as Harry Truman. Truman defeats Dewey. Dewey defeats Truman. Poor Ham. He died. When he died, they didn't know what to do with his body. They thought they were going to stuff him and put him on permanent display, and the astronauts said, hey, wait a minute, they can do that to us. Bury him. Just bury him. So there's Ham. He didn't want, the astronauts did not want Ham to be sent to a taxidermy. There's von Braun again, getting some medal from Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower transferred the Rocket Development Center at the Redstone Arsenal to NASA, and von Braun, his job, develop a giant rocket to send man to the moon. There he is again, this time with John F. Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon. Look, it's that way, Mr. President, that way. You're looking that way. Take the glasses off, you'll see. That way. Von Braun becomes the director of the NASA Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He's the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle, which would be the super booster that would take Americans to the moon. One of von Braun's rockets with Mercury. That's the Redstone. Taking off. Here's Alan Shepard. Alan Shepard sat on the launch pad, and things kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed, and it was only supposed to be a 15-minute flight. And nature called. And Alan Shepard is telling them, gotta go to the bathroom. Gotta go to the bathroom. No, no, you're gonna sit there. Gotta go to the bathroom. Remember I said about the spacesuits? Gotta go to the bathroom. Well, eventually Alan Shepard decided, you know, I'm not gonna listen to these guys. Wet himself. Couldn't hold it in anymore. Alan Shepard also on the launch pad is the delays are, anybody working government here, anybody who's a government worker at one time, if you're a government worker, you know that government has to accept the bid from the lowest bidder, right?
Well, I work for the United States Senate, so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, true, true. Alan Shepard said, you realize I'm sitting on a rocket ship made up of the lowest bidders. Alan Shepard. Anyway, he goes into space, May 5th, 1961, suborbital, only 15 minutes, splashes down, all is good, it's a success, we'll do it one more time with Gus Grissom. He goes up, it's good, except he's off by 600 miles, the hatch opens up and he almost drowns, and Grissom is all of a sudden the unlucky astronaut. Things happen. Get the girl to check the numbers.
Is that the hidden figure?
The hidden figures. Dick said they weren't hidden. Everybody knew they were there. When the brass came, they just disappeared.
Oh.
They were called hidden figures. And that's Katherine Johnson. John Glenn. Check with the girl. Now, she helped with the trajectory of the John Glenn flight. Of course, John Glenn had the problem, nobody knew if the heat shield was going to be on and whether or not the spacecraft was going to survive going through the atmosphere and whether Glenn was going to survive. John Glenn asked the engineers, get the girl, Katherine Johnson, to run the same numbers through the equations that had been programmed into a computer by hand on her desktop mechanical calculating machine. If she says they're good, then I'm ready to go. She was indispensable, but she happened to have two things running against her. One, she was a woman, the other, she was an African American. Dick Hull said the scene in the movie where one of the women's running across the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the rain to go to the bathroom, said repeatedly happened. He said there were no facilities for women at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That's okay. I did talk last year, and I had a woman who told me she went to engineering school at the University of Pittsburgh in the mid-1960s. And she said she's in the engineering building, no restrooms for women. She had to go halfway across the University of Pittsburgh campus to use the facility. That was not uncommon in the 1960s.
State Senate had the women's bathroom for a long time.
And Patsy Mink, the congresswoman from Hawaii, couldn't use the gym. Katherine Johnson, in her book, talked about the calculations that helped sink the Apollo lunar lander with the command ship. She retired in 1986. She had been at Langley for 33 years. Mary Jackson was another one of the hidden figures who helped out, along with Dorothy Vaughan. So they were around. Everybody knew who they were, but when the brass came, they were told, why don't you do something else? And the goals of the 7, actually there were only 6 missions, but there were 7 astronauts because Slayton got sick. Place a manned spacecraft in orbital flight around the Earth, investigate man's performance capabilities and his ability to function in the environment of space, and recover the man, which they almost didn't do with Gus Grissom, and the spacecraft safely. That's Richard Gordon, who ended up being the general manager of the National Football League's New Orleans Saints football team. Go figure, astronaut to football executive. Germany had 4 goals: test an astronaut's ability to fly long distance or long duration missions up to 2 weeks, understand how spacecraft could rendezvous and dock, meet up with another spacecraft on Earth. Gemini was the agenda, Gina rather. Perfect re-entry and landing methods, and understand the effects that longer space flights would have on astronauts. Gemini program. Beat Army. Must have been a Navy guy put that up. Gemini had 19 missions. 2 initial uncrewed test missions, 7 targeted vehicles, 10 crew missions, each carrying 2 astronauts. It was designed as a bridge between 1962 and 66. Now, a couple things happen here. Mercury program is almost over. John Kennedy is basically told, hey, we may not be able to do what you want us to do by the end of the decade. Congress decided, why are we spending all this money on space? Kennedy also was worried because there may not be a mission between 63 and 65, which would be a 2-year gap. He also worried about the money. And knowing he was running for re-election in 1964, he was not going to campaign on keep the money going to NASA. Well, as you know, he gets assassinated, and the space program is funded partly because John Kennedy is a martyr. Lyndon Johnson gets the money to keep the space program as robust as possible. Soviets, meanwhile, are still working. They haven't stopped. Lunar 2 went to the moon in 1959. Other lunar missions would include flybys, the first photographs of the far side of the moon. Meanwhile, the United States, as Dick Hull said, you have to include this. If men is going to the moon, you got to talk about the failures. There were many failures going to the moon. Pioneer aircraft, 0, 1, and 2, first lunar attempts, all failed. Pioneer 3, failed. Pioneer 4 became the first successful lunar mission. Ranger 7 takes pictures of the moon. The first 6 Rangers failed. Ranger 7 is the one that gets there. Its objective was first close-hand images of the moon. Spacecraft take images of the lunar surface, send it back to Earth. Spacecraft would be destroyed upon impact. Series of mishaps led to the failure of the first 6 missions. Things were not going well for the Americans. Eventually, the Surveyor program would be successful, but they still didn't know about the moon, whether it was spongy, whether it was hard, what the lunar dust was made of, whether you could land a heavier craft on the moon. Those were the unknowns going into the Apollo program. The Surveyor, 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7 successfully soft landed on the lunar surface. That took place May 66 to January 68, setting up the Apollo program. That's my friend Orley. Orley is from Iceland, northern Iceland. That's his father. His father actually knew some of the Apollo astronauts that came to Iceland in the 1960s. Now, why would NASA send Apollo training astronauts to Iceland? No, it's not cold. I've been there in the summer. In fact, I could have been in Iceland next week because I got a call yesterday. Can you go to Rotterdam? You can get off in Iceland. I said, I can't do it. I mean, you can't call me 4 days beforehand. No, it's quite nice, Iceland, in the summer. And also, you get 20 hours of daylight in the summer. No, there's a reason why NASA went to Iceland. That's, by the way, Neil Armstrong's family, the Exploration Museum, and a plaque dedicated to all the astronauts that went through there. No, simple. Iceland resembles the moon in some places. The lava fields, the boulders, the steep slopes and all. And so NASA decided, oh, we'll send the astronauts there. The astronauts had a little different take on Iceland, particularly Neil Armstrong, who decided that this is some of the best fishing I've ever seen in my life. Why am I climbing lava boulders when I can fish? Or drink beer. It lasted 2 years, and apparently, according to Orly, that they had a really good time in Iceland, and that thing kind of ended in 1967. But 50 years later, Orly led an expedition with Walter Cunningham and Rusty Schweikert. Harrison Schmitt, one of the last men who ever walked on the moon, and the family of Neil Armstrong, to go see the new lava field. That was happened in 2014 and 15. And there, some of the older astronauts walking through the lava field, so you can see in this picture, it kind of resembles the moon, and this is the astronaut alumni going by bus through the old areas where they trained or fished or drank beer back 50 years ago. Orly has had Bill Anders and Charlie Duke go up to the Central Highlands, and they recreated as best they could when the astronauts allegedly trained in geology in 65, 66, and 67. The Apollo program, as we come near the end. Gus Grissom here. That's in white, Roger Chaffee, who's 31 years old. They're the crew of the Apollo 202. They are going up into space February 21st, 1967, the first test of the Apollo craft. They never made it. Apollo 1 was supposed to be, they changed the name back after the tragedy. Apollo 1 was supposed to be the first low-orbit test of the Apollo craft. Supposed to go out February 21st, 67. January 27th, 1967, dress rehearsal. Dick Hull told me, never should have happened the way it did. Guys are put into the craft. The hatch is sealed. Pure oxygen comes in. There's a spark. Within 90 seconds, it's all over. The spark becomes an inferno. Grissom, White, Chaffee all died. They wanted to make this dress rehearsal as flight-like as possible. They sealed the door, put the pure oxygen in. One spark, that was it. The hatch was designed, they were supposed to be able to open the hatch from the inside. 90 seconds, the entire thing is in flames. Dick Hull said he listened to the audio tapes of these guys dying. He said, it's nothing that you ever want to hear. It's never been released publicly. They all died of asphyxiation. Dick said that when people looked in, when they finally were able to open the hatch, and then they cooled down, you couldn't tell spacesuits from humans. They had been burnt so bad. Officially, they died of asphyxiation. The spacecraft crumpled, just crumpled. This is the aftermath, and you can see this is where the seats were. 1, 2, 3. See, the whole thing burns up. postpones the Apollo mission for 21 months and puts the lunar landing in jeopardy to meet Kennedy's guidelines. Suspended for 21 months. Cause of the accident, they found out why you put pure oxygen in there. They made improvements, safety procedures. Meanwhile, there was unmanned tests of the Saturn V rocket and the lunar module. That's the Apollo 1. This is the window that's burnt out. People just looking at it. And it had an escape. Could have gone off, but they were inside. Everything's thrown for a loop. Not only did they lose 3 guys, but they lost spacecraft. Mike Collins, who was on the Apollo 11 flight, said, you know, even though this thing did happen, there was a silver lining in it. Without Apollo 1 and the lessons learned from it, in all probability, such a fire would have taken place later in the flight. Not only the crew, but the entire spacecraft would have been lost. NASA, with no machinery to examine, could only guess at the causes and how to prevent another one from occurring. Yes, Apollo 1 did cause 3 deaths, but I believe it saved more than 3 later. Apollo 7, Oradell, New Jersey's Wally Schirra. Anybody from Oradell here? Anybody know where Oradell is? And the only reason you know Paramus, you go shopping. Oh, you live? Okay, there's Schirra, here's Cunningham, and there's Isaac. And that's quite the picture, actually, for 1968. But Schirra wasn't too happy. Schirra had a lot of questions because his friend Gus Grissom was killed, the guy he grew up with in space in 1959. There were arguments. Should we launch at all? There were conflicts over a television broadcast. Schirra had a cold. Didn't want to do it. He had a cold. Take some contact. Then we all took contact after that for colds. Never worked. Take some contact. There were complaints about food. Now, come on. Why are you complaining about food? I could go anywhere and it'd be a complaint about food, right?
Yes.
They complain about food. Hey, take your Tang. Drink your Tang. Your Tang is good. Tang. Remember Tang?
Yeah.
Tang. Tang. Take your Tang. There were unhappiness with the spacesuits because it took 30 minutes to get the spacesuits on and off to go to the bathroom. Remember Dick Holt talked about the spacesuits? They're still having problems with the spacesuits. Schirra was 45 years old. He was from New Jersey, so what do you expect? What do you expect? He's going to complain, right? He was 45 years old, and this was it. He's the center of the disputes. This was his last flight, and there they are again, Apollo 7 astronauts inside the craft, or looking at the craft. But Apollo 7 did everything that Apollo 1 was supposed to do. Test the command module and the service module in low Earth orbit and come back. How many people remember seeing Earthrise for the first time? It was Christmas Eve, 1968, Apollo 8. Bill Anders takes his camera. And that's what you saw. Earthrise. We choose to go to the moon, JFK, May 25th, 1961. And here are the 3 astronauts that circled the moon. Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Tom Hanks. Do you know that in the Apollo 13 movie, Jim Lovell played somebody else while Tom Hanks played Jim Lovell? He was in the movie playing somebody else. And there's Tom Hanks playing him. Anyway, they circled the moon, 1968, Christmas Eve. The mission was changed because the lunar orbiter wasn't ready from Grumman. So all of a sudden they said, okay, let's just go around the moon. And we'll do an orbital lunar flight. That's the first time you ever saw a picture like that, in 1968. Again, Anders in his camera and the whole Earth. Didn't Pearl Buck do the good Earth? Yeah. He did the whole Earth. They circle the moon on Christmas Eve. Read passages from Genesis, basically saying, hey, the Earth is good, don't mess with the Earth, everything is going to be okay. The lunar module would debut in space in 1969, in March of 1969, on Apollo 9. Grumman finally gets its aircraft done. Third crewed mission, First flight of the command and service module with the lunar module. They have a few things that James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweiker have to do. They spend 10 days in space, test out the lunar module engines, the backpack support system, navigation systems, and get to dock with the craft. Important steps going to the moon. Apollo 10, Stafford, who I met, Young, and Cernan. Cernan would be the last man to walk on the moon. And there's the lunar module, close to the moon. It would go down to 8.4 nautical miles before the moon, and then would separate, and the top half would blow off and go back to the command module. It was launched on May 18, 1969, the dress rehearsal, short of the lunar landing. It's flown within 8.4 nautical miles of the surface and powered up, and they go back. July 16th, 1969. We're almost there. 50 years ago, the Apollo 11 takes off from Cape Kennedy. And there he is, Dick Hull. Dick Hull had an interesting role in the Apollo 11 flight. He was in Australia, and he's the guy taking the video back from the moon to show it to the world. And the first image Dick Hull sees is that. That would be one hell of a small step for man and a giant leap for mankind, because Neil Armstrong is upside down. The first images coming back to Earth, Neil Armstrong's upside down. And they don't have very much time to figure out what's wrong. They have like 20 seconds. And all of a sudden Dick remembers, hey wait, we're using a different system. He has to scurry across the room, flip a switch so you could see something like that. Now let me ask you a question. If you saw that image, or this image, this grainy black and white image, if you saw that grainy black and white image of a guy upside down, would you think that was a real thing?
No.
Dick straightened out the picture just in time, and you know, we spent billions of dollars to get to the moon, right? Billions of dollars, so MTV could have